My talk is two sides of the same coin, contracting the right way. I'm going to be taking a look at how to improve the working process between contractors and the teams that hire them. In other words, we're going to lean in and facilitate collaboration and alignment in order to synergize collective deliverable engagement and pivot into a process disruption in order, never mind. Let's just have a think about how to make it a bit better for everyone involved. Who am I? I am Jay Fernandes. I'm a man of many hats, both literally and figuratively. I have done many things in games, from audio to QA to design to running 2 studios. I'm the director for Fern Studios, which is largely a contracting and porting studio, as well as Bad Haircut Games, which is my local development studio. I'm also an American who moved to Melbourne a couple years ago. It's pretty great. I have about 16 years of experience in the development industry. 10 of those has been as a contractor for platform releases, specifically QA, porting, engineering, release management, all that stuff. I also worked at Sony as first-party QA for a while, and I've been working even longer as a freelance audio professional for music, sound effects, tech, things like that. I've also worked on a lot of games. I'm not kidding when I say I've worked on a lot of games. This isn't even all of them. So I've probably worked on about 100 games total across God knows how many platforms since 2009. For context, when I worked at Sony, they hadn't even announced the PlayStation 4 for 4 more years. So what do I mean by contracting? I'm talking about hiring somebody, usually to assist with a specific area of knowledge or a task that they specialize in. Generally, it's to fill a gap on the team where somebody might not know how to do that or it doesn't have time to do that. For QA specifically, I'm mainly just going to be talking about functionality and like console compliance right now, but there are lots of other areas of QA where this is also applicable. I think this talk is important because contracting is a popular way for companies to grow, gain knowledge, or resource help without the risks associated with hiring internally, especially for QA. Many smaller studios can also be made up mostly of contractors in different areas of development. And even larger studios and publishers, platforms, they use contract QA regularly. COVID and recent events also have attributed to having remote working and contracting be a bit more prevalent in more areas of development, for better or worse. This talk is not going to be about legal stuff. I'm not going to talk about the difference between contractors and employees. I'm not going to talk about how to find good contractors or how to find more work. I'm not going to talk about how to price or value any of that. I'm not necessarily going to talk about how to test better, and I'm also not going to talk about how to make good games, but I'm hoping that if we make the process between contractors and teams better, those last two will probably happen naturally. A few caveats. There are tons of ways to improve or streamline your working relationship with people and teams that you work with. I'm just going to be touching on a few. These work well for my teams and our values and the culture that I've set up. So you might have to adjust a little bit for yours depending on how your teams are set up. So when I talk about values, I assume that if we're hired as a contractor or we hire others, we are immediately on the same side working towards a common goal. So things like an us versus them mentality are largely unhelpful, or separating people or siloing them. We also value what I call big picture thinking and feedback, even if it's negative. So having a space where you can talk about those openly is important, which means that communication and transparency are key for that to be successful. So now we're going to talk about some catchphrases. Documentation, everyone's favorite. Be proactive, not just reactive. It's terrific to be specific. Context is key. And sometimes it's really hard to deal with big feelings during stressful times. Also known as fun with feedback. Each of these areas I'm going to dive into a little bit more and give some anecdotes about how we have approached these as somebody who hires contractors and works with them, as well as being a contractor ourselves. So the first one, documentation. We're going to touch on some small things as well as some larger things. So throughout this talk, you might see me say something or mention something and go, it's not really that big of a deal. Or like, that's probably really easy to fix. And you're right. But when it happens again and again over time, it is unhelpful, right? And it can cause a lot of friction in that relationship. So documentation, access, and use is a really common one. Do I have access to this document you just sent me? If I click that link, am I gonna have to ask for permission to see it? Avoiding using company-specific jargon. If you're hiring contractors, they probably have no idea how your company works. They don't know all those terms, they don't know what those acronyms mean. You can help your contractor along by giving them some insight into what those mean or trying to avoid it in communication with them. Catering it to what your audience finds useful, I think that's for both sides as well. Some problems, if you do not do these, having to ask for permission repeatedly is kind of annoying. I'm sure that's happened to everyone, even internally. The problem comes in, especially for those working in Australia or other places, time zones can make that even longer. So if somebody sends me a document at their end of the day in the US, and I go to click on it in my morning in Australia, and I don't have access to it, we probably have to wait till the next day to get that done, right? So not a big deal, but now we've lost 8 hours of me working in whatever document that was, or longer. So not having access can also cause delays or misinformed decisions, especially if I need to make a quick decision based on important information and I can't see it, kind of a problem. There's also back and forth with asking clarifying questions to know what something actually means, especially if teams use different terms for the same thing. This is the like company-specific jargon and knowing what your audience is probably looking for. So in QA specifically, a lot of times like in compliance, you might mention TRCs or XRs or BBTs and things like that. The company who hired you might not know what those mean. So this is an area that you can help kind of smooth out a little bit of back and forth and confusion. And what you need from a document and what someone else needs from the document might not be the same thing. So if I make a QA report for somebody, what I'm looking for out of that QA report might not be the same thing that the producer or the owner of the other company or the QA lead of the other company is looking for to make their decisions. So it's important to kind of think about what that information might be. So I've split these a little bit on each side. So I'll just go down each side. So for contractors, things that you can think about is, does everyone have access who needs this document? I have a QA report, I'm sending it off. Do I need to double check to make sure the tech lead or the lead programmer also has access to it? Do they need to make a decision on something? Are the docs digestible to others, or are they full of QA-specific knowledge or studio-specific knowledge that when I send it to somebody else, it's just gonna look like a completely different language to them, right? Are the findings presented in a way that's easy to understand? Sometimes we'll find issues, and everybody internally might understand that that's a big deal, but you share it with somebody else, and they might not take it the same way, right? Maybe it's presented in a way that they didn't understand, or you get some miscommunications there. So for internal teams, very similarly, does everyone have access? If you have a contractor working on your internal game and you bring somebody in, do they have access to everything they need, or is it just tied to your email alias, right, for your studio? So anybody else is gonna have to keep asking for new things. Do you have documents that have very specific narrative, scene, time code named files, and you're just listing those in the report for everybody to look at? Is everybody gonna know what that means if they're not on your internal team? And also what's useful for the contractor to know to do their job. I think that's a big one that we run into a lot, is a lot of times we'll start working on something and then we'll learn new information later that would have been really nice to know at the start. including things like plans for patches or DLC and things like that. Which leads me to my next point. Be proactive, not just reactive. So QA professionals will probably hear something along these lines a lot, where it's not just about testing, it's about making better processes in those areas that you can do that in. This is one of those where you can make a better process and it can help with things down the line. Teams that hire contractors can also think about these processes beforehand to make them a lot smoother for everyone. And you can be proactive about these processes basically at any time, even before you're considering bringing on a contractor or trying to get work as a contractor. Some examples, as I talk about bigger picture thinking, is you have a studio, you know you're going to test it someday. How is a contractor going to interact with all the stuff that you have? Do you have Slack channels? Is it Discord? Do you have an intranet of some sort that somebody needs to VPN into? Is there information on that the contractor is going to need access to? How do they access that? Who is going to report to them? Who decides what the responsibilities for that contractor are, right? On the contracting side, you can also ask a lot of those questions. You can see if bug priorities are the same. You can see what bug database you're going to be using. That's a common one for us because we are largely working with independent studios that sometimes don't have their own bug databases. So do we use yours? Do you use ours, right? And we think about how we would integrate other people into our bug database long before we have a contract with them. So that once we do, the process is smooth, we already have everything set up, and everybody can get just right into working on what they need to do. So some other examples about being proactive. Sharing important information or concerns, even if there's a chance that it's known. This is kind of a common one that we run into when we hire QA contractors, is they will sit on information because they think it's not necessarily relevant to what they got hired to do, right? So a really common example is if they're working on a console game and they're testing for functionality and they see something that is very obviously a compliance failure for that platform, right? So just as an example, they're playing the game and they see a term for a competing platform, right? Or they see something where that's bad, right? And they sit on it, right? They assume everybody knows. The problem is people might have known and forgotten, or they might have thought they took it out and it's still in there. So raising those concerns, even as a quick, hey, heads up, can be really helpful. Even if the other party says, oh, yeah, that's known, we do know it's in there, but you can at least move forward to mitigate that being in there for the final build. So now maybe we can write a bug on it. Maybe you can suggest something like that, right? So this is also important for people who hire contractors. Sharing important information is kind of paramount to having a contractor be effective. Another great example of this that we've run into as a contractor hired is they decided to work on different platforms. So the platform we were working on wasn't relevant anymore. It would have been nice to know, right, before we started testing it a bunch. So make sure to share that important information and make sure that you're thinking about others having that. Being proactive helps there. So important decisions like release dates, that's another one that comes up a lot. We will get what I call reactive release date changes, where somebody will come up with a date somehow, right? Looking at a magic 8-ball or throwing darts at a dartboard. And then they'll start going to each kind of team individually or just saying it in meetings and then having to change it based on somebody saying, hey, that date's not going to work, right? You say you want to release in 1 month, but we also have on this other schedule 2 months of development and QA planned. How does that work, right? Or, hey, you're not taking into account that certain platforms require weeks of waiting before the game can go live, even after it passes submission, right? So these are things where being proactive can help, where both contractors and the people that hire them can make sure that everybody is kind of in the room when important decisions are being made so that everybody can agree on a nice date to begin with, right? The bottom part we kind of talked about a bit, just thinking about how teams work together. That's a great step, right? If you're not sure specifically how you can be proactive, even just thinking about it, you're already doing some of the work, right? How will information be passed to each other? Who are these decision makers? Who do I need to tell if there's a problem, right? Do we use the same bug priority system? Things like that. So we talked about some problems already, but information or status only being shared when specifically asked about it. This is kind of a keystone of reactive planning and thinking, is that, well, I didn't tell anybody because nobody asked me, right? Well, if it affects the goal, ideally somebody would bring it up somewhere, right? Timelines and plans created have to get changed multiple times. That also just takes a lot of time and focus away from your development teams, your QA teams, because they have to constantly stop what they're doing and come up with a new date plan based on information. And then tomorrow is the same thing because new information showed up. And nobody's testing anymore because we're too busy making schedules, right? So coming up with a solution on the spot can also be much less effective than one that was planned from the beginning. So a lot of times when I work with teams, if they hire me, the first thing I'm going to ask them about their release date is what happens when you miss that? And everybody goes, well, that's not going to happen, right? And the reason I'm asking is because I want to know if they have a plan for when it fails, right? We're planning to submit 2 weeks from now. Great. What happens when you miss that date, right? Is there a backup plan? Is there enough time to buffer so that your release date doesn't change? And that's me being proactive and trying to get them to think about a plan C or a plan B, and so on. So don't wait to share information or issues that could affect the release of the game. For internal teams, please don't wait to share information that is helpful to your contractors and QA teams, especially if it directly affects what they're doing. Like I mentioned before, DLC, not telling them until 2 days before you're submitting for the final build. Hey, by the way, we're gonna have DLC for this. Platforms changing, or major issues that you see with the game as a QA tester that you know could affect the release of the game somehow, right? Even if you're unsure, we have a culture of just asking to double check, so you can bring it up to one of our producers or whoever and say, hey, I am not a compliance expert, but this feels wrong. Or it crashes every once in a while, so it might not be an issue, but I don't know if this is actually a higher priority, right? You can also help teams see issues beforehand, or at least plan for them to happen in situations. So those are things as a contractor where, especially if you've done it a bunch of times and you can kind of look at a game and see everything else in the game works okay, but you're adding multiplayer really late in the cycle, you're probably gonna have a lot of problems with that. Are you sure that the schedule is accurate for you adding this section of the game so late in the process? For internal teams, you can also come up with alternate plans beforehand and build those in as part of your process for date planning and things like that, and share them with your contractors, right? Hey, we're submitting in a couple weeks. We know that it's a little tight. If we fail, here's what we're gonna do next, right? So everybody knows immediately what happens if they see a report come in or if they see something come in to move to plan B, so to speak. Some more problems we talked about a little bit already. Communicating important timelines, making sure timelines are relevant to all parties. Those are big ones. And then just having a basic workflow in mind is probably the biggest way to be proactive on almost any team, is just thinking about what that workflow looks like for contractors and for internal teams, especially if you've never really hired them. One thing I always tell people if they're unsure about how to work with me is before we start on it, I can just tell them, this is basically what it's gonna look like, right? They can ask me questions about, well, how do you handle this? who do you send this to? And I can give them a basic overview of what that looks like for them to help them plan for their setup. And in some cases, I've even worked with their internal teams a little bit before our larger team started in order to set up that workflow for them. They wanted a bug database. They never had one. They didn't know how to set one up. They were using programs that weren't great for it. And we came up with some solutions for them so that by the time we started and everybody else started with us, they already had a workflow that they were confident in. So our next one, it's terrific to be specific. This applies to many things. So when I'm talking about being specific in communications or responsibilities, this is for bugs you write, reports you write, things you post in Slack, emails you send to contractors. Literally everything can benefit from being more specific, right? So having clear priorities and goals is the first thing. We've gone on to do projects where we're there to solve a problem, but it's not quite clear how we're going to do that. So there's a little bit of exploratory time for us to deal with it and kind of come up with what these goals are. If you do not have clear priorities or goals, what's going to end up happening is everybody on the team is going to come up with their own in place of it, right? And a lot of times, those are not going to be ideal. So having clear priorities and goals when you hire someone, or if you're getting hired, making sure that you know what those are is really good. And it will help make that process go smoothly, because everything past that point, you can always point back to those, right? So as you're working through the game and they ask you a question, you can go, well, what was the priority, right? What is the goal here? We talked about it early on. The goal was to release by Christmas, right? If we do these things and we add this, I believe that we were gonna miss that date. The priority was releasing by Christmas. So maybe we should revisit this, right? For teams, especially when you're hiring contractors, I think it's important to take a good, honest look at your strengths and your weaknesses and use those to create specific responsibilities for the people that you're hiring to fill those gaps, as well as for your internal team. So a lot of times we'll get hired to work with larger companies who know how to do QA. They might even have QA teams of their own. They know how to do release management. They know how to do porting or audio. And we're there to help fill gaps, right? Or we're there to help fill time or resources that they just don't have right now. And if everybody isn't on the same page about what those responsibilities are, you're gonna run into a point where two teams or two people are working separately, and then they get a little bit closer and closer to what each other are doing, right? Really common when we work with publishers. They most likely have their own compliance QA internally, but we'll do compliance QA for publishers as well to double check. Are we supposed to overlap completely? Or are they checking specific things and we are checking specific things, right? So if nobody knows, what might end up happening is somebody might assume and go, hey, other team, they got it. They're doing it all, right? And then when you look at the issues come back, everybody goes, oh, nobody did it, right? Everybody assumed somebody else did. So make sure those responsibilities are specific and known to everybody. Having clear responsibilities, expectations, and tasks, including in the contract, is also important. I know I'm not talking about legal stuff. I will just say, if you are a contractor, I would highly advise you to be proactive and think about what happens when things don't work out and have it in the contract so that it's very clear what everybody's responsibility is when certain things occur, right? As some extreme examples, if I work for a company and then that company shuts down, what are my responsibilities in that contract now? What are their responsibilities? Do I still get paid? Do they still have to pay me, right? So it's good to know specifically how that's gonna work. Avoiding vagueness in communication, that's also another one for bugs too. Usually we'll see this when we're working with other companies who aren't super familiar with how certain things work. Maybe they're on a new platform, maybe they've never touched a controller in their life, right? It happens, and if you're vague in bugs especially, what you might see is misalignment, right? Maybe a bug comes in, it's written as a high priority issue, but all it says is the controller is wrong. It's not a great bug, right? I go to look further, what do they mean by that? Because as soon as I look at it, knowing what I know, I'm thinking maybe the term is wrong, maybe they used the wrong image, maybe they used line art when they weren't supposed to. And I go and look at the issue, and it just says the same thing. The controller is wrong. It should be fixed. Great. Fantastic, right? So other people read that, and they don't know what to do with it because it's marked as a high priority, but it's vague, right? Maybe no image was attached, maybe nothing was mentioned beforehand. And so now there's room for interpretation, right? Well, maybe I'll go take a look at it and see if I can figure out what's wrong. And maybe they do the wrong thing, right? That bug could definitely be written better. So if you want to be specific with bug writing, you could say something along the lines of, on PlayStation 5, there's a picture of a Switch controller. That obviously fails this TRC. You can't do that. Here is what that fix should look like, or here's what the expected outcome is. And now, everybody is aligned on why that is a high priority issue. Because that's going to fail compliance. You're not going to be able to release your game like that. There's no room for interpretation there because you said exactly what needs to be done. So there's little room for misunderstanding. And now everybody knows exactly what needs to be done, right? The part about who is responsible for doing it, you might still need to iron that out, especially in our case where we port as well as do QA. That comes up a lot, where we'll see an issue and we know it's wrong and we tell them it's wrong. And then my next question is, so who fixes it? Do you want to fix it or should I fix it? And as long as everybody agrees, it's not usually a big deal. If nobody agrees, then you have to kind of figure out what to do next. This is also where you'll see problems where having something shared or communicated not being treated with the same urgency or care because there's assumptions or gaps present. I gave one example of how that can happen with the controller thing. Somebody who's not familiar with compliance testing or how that submission process works might go, well, who cares if I called it a gamepad, right? It's still a controller. Everybody knows what I mean, right? While you're over there looking at it, freaking out, going, oh my God, this is gonna fail us in submission for sure, and wondering why the other person is not also freaking out. And it's because they probably just don't know. It was never communicated to them, right? So contractors, you can be specific in your communications to people. I use bugs as an example, but it's helpful for chat, emails, reporting, any of that. You want people to be clear what the issues are, why they're important, and what that resolution is, right? Because even if they're clear what the issues are, and they know it's important, and they try to fix it and mess up, if they didn't know what the resolution was supposed to be, they might do it wrong. And then you have to write another issue and say, no, this is still wrong. You can't call it a D-pad instead. So now, be clear about the risks and if there's gaps in coverage or something that you're not doing. This is a big one. We get a lot of times where we'll hire contractors for other studios to perform work and we'll essentially manage them. And what'll happen is the developer has an idea in their head of what the QA team is gonna do, right? They see all the numbers, they see how many testers it is, and they go, yeah, we hired 10 compliance testers to do compliance on our game. They're gonna run through the whole thing and find all the bugs. And then I get to explain to them that that's not what that testing does. They're probably not even gonna complete the entire game, right? If you hired compliance testers, they're gonna be looking at compliance for whatever that console is. And then I show them the checklist and say, if it's not in here, they're basically not gonna look at it, right? Unless you tell them to, and unless you hired people to do that. So knowing that there's a gap in coverage there and being clear that, hey, I know you hired me to do this job, that's not my job, right? Just so you know, is helpful. you might run into some people who want to go back and forth a little bit about it, but what you're doing is helping them understand that what you're hired to do covers this specific area, and if they want something larger than that, you can either help them do that, or they need to hire somebody else to do that, because everybody is trying to get the game out, right? So you're just telling them why that might not happen. For internal teams, being specific about what your priorities and goals are is really useful so that your contractor can help you get there. So if you have in mind what a priority is, we absolutely need to finish this demo by the next Steamfest, right? We do not care about any of these other issues right now because those are not going to be in the demo, right? Seems simple enough. A lot of times that's not communicated very well or at all. And then you get a mismatch of priorities where testers are writing bugs for things that the developer thinks doesn't matter. And then we go back and look at it and say, well, look, you gave them the full build in the QA folder. You didn't say anywhere that you were only going to do the demo for Steam Next Fest. And you didn't say anywhere that this is only what's covered in the demo. So of course they're going to test the full game. That's what they were under the assumption that you were doing. Also, if responsibilities change, make sure those are communicated clearly. We get hired a lot to work on many areas where our only purpose is to gap fill, right? We're not going to work on the game for the rest of the life cycle of the game. We're not going to be working on this specific area for years and years. We're literally there until they hire somebody to replace us. And that's fine, as long as everybody's aware of that. But once that person gets hired, communicate that to your contractor, right? Especially if responsibilities change. So, hey, I know before you were going to handle all of these areas of multiplayer or whatever. You no longer need to do that because we have somebody who can do that now. Instead, I need you to work over here, right? That's also helpful because you'll avoid a lot of double work where you don't really need to do it necessarily. Documentation can also be really helpful here if you are hiring contractors, because usually it's their first time seeing the game, right? We'll get hired on. People have been working on that game for 5 years. They know everything there is to know about the game, the characters, the setting. I get a build folder and a weird code name, and I'm not sure what Waffles Multiplayer Game 2019 means. And then I'll boot it up and go, oh, okay, I see. It's an arena shooter, or it's something else. If I have documentation that's given to me beforehand, that's specific about what the game is, what it's trying to do, that can be really helpful for me, because now I know how it works, now I know how it's supposed to work, and now I can test better around it as well. So this leads into our next one about context. We've already talked a bit about context, but context is probably the most important thing that we'll run into when we try to hire people or when we get hired on games, is just getting everybody on the same page, right? It allows for better alignment so that everybody knows what's supposed to be done, and it also allows for trying to achieve goals under a constraint. If I do not have the context of how you're trying to make this game, and you try to hire me to test your game, let's say, I'm going to come up with solutions that I think are useful, and you might look at them and go, well, this is way outside what we were thinking, right? I have a budget of $2 and a shoestring, and you're quoting me $300,000 to test this game. Okay, well, now that I know the context, now I can help you find an actual solution based on your actual needs, right? Every game is also unique, so having context about specific systems, characters, differentiators, marketing points, those are actually really good for contractors to have. So if you're on a team hiring contractors, you want them to know what your game is. You want them to know what your game is like and how it works, because they can use their knowledge that you hired them for to try to figure out how to utilize it best for your game, not just anybody's game, right? So problems if nobody has any context. You might get information that's just way outside of what you were expecting, right? A really common one is with budgets. You know, people will ask me, well, how much is it to test this game? I don't know, anywhere from $1,000 to $10 million, right? It just kind of depends what you want to do. If I have context for timeline, budgets, team size, then you can start making something that's more specific, right? You might also end up with plans of action that don't end up working as expected or not as ideally as other methods could have because you didn't have that context to begin with, right? So this goes back again to when you're being proactive and making plans. If you don't have the context to create a solution that works well, and then you go back and look and everybody goes, well, why did we do it that way? And it's like, well, because at the time, that's all we knew, right? We didn't know that this particular Unity version would have an issue that would cause bugs to happen, or that the development would delay so long that your SDK expired and you need to upgrade again, right? So having that context is useful because then you can come up with plans beforehand and say, hey, I noticed that your release date is going to be right after when the SDK expires, and I know that you're not doing compliance testing for us, but I just want to be sure that you're aware that that might happen, right? And so that you can plan for that. You might also see things that are getting done that seem contrary to what you would do or that you would expect. This is a big one when there's no context, especially shared between teams, where each of you have a different big picture as you're looking at it. So if we hire QA contractors and they're writing up bugs and we're going, why are you writing up these small C issues, right, when we're trying to ship this game? We might go back and ask ourselves, well, did we give them the context of what we needed them to do? Did we tell them that we were trying to do this way? For contractors, it's the same thing. You might see companies doing things where you're like, I don't know why you're doing this. This seems like a bad decision. Partially, it's probably just missing. It might just be missing context, right? You need to finish everything by this release date, but you can't move the release date. They didn't say they can't move the release date, but every time you suggest it, they shy away from it. They change the subject, they get mad. It might be because that's the day that they run out of money, right? They have to release the game by that date, and they don't feel like sharing that. So this can lead to othering and kind of frustration if you're not giving context to people, especially repeatedly, and then decisions are getting made while other people feel left in the dark. This is something that can happen a lot with QA, especially where you throw your reports and your bugs into the ether, you don't really hear back about them, they don't seem to be getting fixed, you don't know why. This is where context can be really useful. Sometimes it's a really easy answer. Hey, the person who's supposed to be working and fixing all these, they're sick. So they're just not gonna be working on these right now. So you're not gonna see any changes to the bug database till they're back, right? So as a contractor, ways to add context or adding context can be just clarifying questions. You can also add context to like why an issue should be fixed sometimes, especially for compliance, that can be important. A lot of times we'll write issues where we'll note it as a failure and it'll have the XR attached and whatever. And we'll still get the same follow-up question that is, yeah, but do we really have to fix that? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is maybe, or maybe you can do it a different way. But if we add context to what it is and say, hey, this is an issue, we do need to fix it, and no, this is not something that we can get a waiver for, you can kind of move things along a little quicker. If you need context and you don't have any, you can also ask, right? I've done it a lot of times. We'll get hired to a team, they'll make a weird decision, and then I'll just frankly ask about it. Partially, that is something that I can do in the position that I'm in. So I would be sure that the way that you're asking it makes sense to what you're doing. So you don't just go burst into a room and go, why is this the release date? You can also help explain why context is needed if you need more context, right? Hey, I'm testing this game. It's this narrative. There's a bunch of different characters. It seems like there's some multiple endings here that I'm not quite getting. Can I get the context of these characters? Is there like lore or anything that I need to know? For internal teams, sometimes constraints are unavoidable. You have a set budget, you have a set timeline. Just communicating those can be helpful. Then your contractors can come up with solutions based on those. Context can also speed things up so that extra work isn't done again. Example, lore and characters for a game. If I have to play through and make my own list of what all the lore and characters are because I'm supposed to test to make sure that all the lore is actually accurate in the handbook in the game, that's going to take a lot longer than if somebody shared that stuff with me beforehand, right? And then just thinking internally about what you actually want and need from your contractors can add a lot of context as well. So real quick, some fun with feedback. Everyone is a human being working on this game, and so every interaction actually has an emotional or morale implications besides just affecting the projects or the tasks at hand. Feedback is really important both for us as contractors. We will seek feedback from people that we work with, as well as from contractors that we hire. We will give feedback if they're willing to take it in order to make that process better for when we work next time. Mistakes and miscommunications will happen, unfortunately. Knowing how to mitigate those so that you can learn from them is useful, and that's also a part of feedback. And being prepared to give and receive constructive feedback, and ideally be able to act on it, is probably the most important part there. So not giving feedback, not expressing concerns, people might not know what they're doing wrong, they might not understand that those reports aren't that helpful, or that they think you're being a bit brash when you're talking to other people, right? It can cause mounting frustrations, no way to feel like issues are going to be resolved, or feeling like you're being ignored, or that tasks are just not being aligned on properly. A lot of this stuff can be solved by transparency and communication. So feedback for both sides can help with that process to help make it go more smoothly. Something for contractors to keep in mind is that sometimes people can't or won't do what expert opinion suggests. There are many times where we will give our expert opinion and they go, yep, that's cool. Anyways, and then kind of move on to the next thing. Don't take it personally. There's a lot of reasons why that might happen. For internal teams, same thing. Please consider why you hired an expert in the first place, and how much you're willing to change or listen to what they tell you. So that you can approach the whole thing with the attitude of, this isn't what we were expecting, but yes, we agree this is a better way forward, right? For both sides, it's okay to say that this isn't working. What can we change so that it does, right? It's not a fun conversation to have, but I've had many of them where we say, hey, this isn't working. We're not getting what we need. You're not getting what you need. How can we change this? Do we need different meetings? Do we need other people involved? And that's basically it. So thank you. Hopefully we have a little bit of time for some Q&A. And if you're using the app, I will answer those later because I have to go click on the link and do some stuff. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Thank you.